Graphics, visual styles. So there are different ways to show what we're looking at right here. You don't always have to look at it in this hidden line mode with just black and white. You can also add some color to this as well. This is found right down at the bottom of the view. It's called Visual Style, Hidden Line. So these are your visual styles or your views. When you click on them, the first one is wireframe. And this one can be useful at times when you're trying to use it as kind of an X-ray mode. Perhaps there's something behind where you're working that you want to click on and you wouldn't otherwise be able to click on it. And you can't otherwise pick on it because it's in a wireframe mode. Next you have hidden line, and that's the typical one that you'll see in 3D modes. And that's a good view for just your general getting a good feel for the 3D model that you're making. The next one is called shaded. I very rarely use this one because I find it a little bit too hard to grasp where the edges are. Revit always wants you to click on an edge. If you try to click on something just based upon its face, it usually won't do it. What you'll want to do is pick, instead of shaded, you can say shaded with edges. And shaded with edges gives you both the shade and the hidden line, best of both worlds. And you're able to click on things. It does look a little cartoony, but we can even adjust that cartoony look and make that even look more realistic. Next mode you have is consistent colors. And that might be funny. What does consistent colors mean? Well, sometimes when you pick a color for a shade, you really want it to stay that color. Whereas shaded with edges, what it does is it provides a little bit of ambient light. So you'll notice that this roof is really just one color. And our eyes are telling us, yeah, that's just one color. But really, if you were to zoom in, those are two separate colors. That's a darker blue than that. Now, if I were to change this to consistent colors, everything there, all that blue is exactly the same. And sometimes, again, when you're trying to use the shade tools for colors and for design that way, you want that to be consistent. Next, you have realistic. Now, you look at this, and our model is very simplistic, and we don't really have a lot of materials applied to things. If I were to just zoom in here, you'd see that the grass has sort of a grass texture on it. If this wall, let's say it were brick, I'm going to temporarily change that, and I'll change it back later. You can see here, when I zoom in, it sort of has that brick feel to it, as opposed to just being a cartoon lines with a color. It gives you a little bit more texture. This can be a good look if you combine it with another couple of tools, and I'll show you those just briefly. Now, if we just look over here in this other section, this is another button. It's called Shadows, but it has a number of different graphic overrides within that. If I were to just click that on, and I'm going to go to Graphic Display Options, you'll notice here that there's a number of different things. So you can change the sun intensity, apply. You notice it just got brighter. You can say, I want my indirect light, sort of like ambient light, I want that to be brighter. I want to cast shadows. Apply that. Now you can see shadows. I can choose ambient occlusion. Apply that. And what ambient occlusion does, it's sort of subtle, but just watch near the ground where there's another object. Ambient occlusion accounts for that, and it says, okay, well, that'll be darker than just around the building. And that gives it yet a little bit more realism. You also have a gradient background, and that can make things yet more realistic. If I say, okay, now right now, you can't really tell much about a gradient background, but if I were to just orbit, you can see there, that's blue. Why don't we take what we've learned here and apply it to a camera view and see what other options we can put in there? Okay, so before we flip back to our camera view where we're going to apply these a little bit differently, let's just undo a little bit, and we want to put this back to where it was as far as the wall types and so on. So I'm just hitting undo. You can see there's the wall type. So now it's back shaded with edges. That's a nice view. And we can just confirm that shaded with edges is, there we go, that's a good one to use usually. Okay, let's click on 3D Views, Exterior. And we have this view. You know, again, our model is not awesome from the outside. It's very much of a shell just for the purposes of the interior. But let's just use this and see what we can apply what we've learned. So first of all, let's turn this to realistic. Now let's go to our shadows, which is just the little ball with a shadow under it. Let's go to our graphic display options. Let's turn on cast shadows. Let's turn on ambient occlusion. Let's turn on gradient background. And, let's play with the sun a bit, indirect light. The other thing I want to try is this little edges tool. See how it says silhouette style? Right now it's set to wide lines. You can click on that and you can choose which particular silhouette style that you're going to be using. You'll see what this means in a second when I click OK. Now we're in a realistic mode, so the silhouette style really isn't going to take effect. But you can see here we've got a gradient sky. We have some materials showing. And once your model gets better developed and you get some materials, this mode can actually be quite powerful without having to go through this step of actually rendering. Now, what if I were to switch this to shaded with edges? Let's go over to our shadows again and graphic display options. You'll notice here that the silhouette style is wide lines. And what that does is it goes around the outside and it puts on the wide line style. Now, it's hard to tell because of the scale we're at, but it does in fact do that. Now you can just say OK to this, and you can see that it's starting to give it a little bit more of a artistic feel to it and a little bit more depth to what we're working on. I'd like to add one more thing before we're done. A lot of these tools that I'm using, for instance, realistic mode, number 1, and number 2, if I go into graphic display options, ambient occlusion, they rely on a checkbox, and that's for hardware acceleration. And you always have to make sure that your hardware is authorized by Autodesk, and that's something you can just Google authorized graphic cards for Revit, whatever version you're going to be working on, and you'll get a list of all the graphic cards that are available for that. If I go to the big R, just drop that down. Let's go down to options. Let's go into graphics. Notice here it says use hardware acceleration, and then it's using Direct 3D. So you want to make sure your card is Direct 3D compatible as well. As long as that is on, you can do the ambient occlusion as well as the realistic mode.